right. So again, I'm KG, product manager for Web AI in Chrome. And this is the second session that we are doing. This one is really focusing on one of the challenge/opportunities that I think that might exist, which is about sharing AI models across origin. So this is hopefully going to be a brief overview, and we are going to spend as much time as possible on discussing the potential next steps together, see if there are like other issues that we should pay attention to. Quick recap for those who missed the previous session. Built-in AI is the combination of AI APIs and a model ecosystem. In Chrome, we have Gemini Nano, as well as other expert models for different use cases, Google Translate model, for instance. And then potentially like some fine-tunings of the models for better quality on different use cases. So APIs are very high level, things like summarizer, translator, and prompt. And essentially, the whole point is to help us understand what you want so that we can make the best of what exists today and over time improve that, replacing models, changing fine-tunings, and so on. All right, another way to look at it is essentially it's the combination of browser managed models and APIs so that website can easily deploy AI features without having to micromanage all the aspects of AI. Alternatively, people can also do it-yourself AI. They can do custom AI using WebGPU, WebNN, WebAssembly, sometimes with the help of an AI framework. And that does provide a lot of control. However, this has some potential challenge depending on the AI use case you have in mind. So if your use case require a large model, it could be like long downloads, a lot of data usage, a lot of storage pressure, and maybe it's not very practical to do so, especially if your use case requires an LLM. And this is where built-in AI has maybe an unfair advantage because it has shared AI models across origin. And there are a few other like magic aspects to it, which I've listed there. And over time, I would like to find ways to maybe give access to those magic tricks so that this whole system is not limited to 1P only models, and it's more inclusive of what the ecosystem wants to do with it so that we can explore more use case at a faster clip. But for today's session, I really want to focus on the shared AI model across origin. All right, so with that, solving this, essentially, this is what we currently have today, which is two isolated worlds. There's the built-in AI in the background, like this huge wall full of like bricks that you can't really move. And then in the foreground, you have like your own custom AI where you have to build it from the ground up yourself. And there is no sharing between different websites. And I'm, again, especially interested in the sharing AI models like aspect of it, because it is the biggest piece of the puzzle, both in terms of like the data size, but also the potential impact. And so if we can unlock that, I would expect to see more use case as well as competition for quality, performance, and reach, and faster innovation for new needs. So all in all, I think it's great for users. But as you probably know, sharing resource across origin is really hard. Many people have tried. Self-included. And I want to focus on some of the key challenges that I think we face, especially when we focus on AI models. So one is the fact that on most devices, unless you have like a very fancy like gaming rigs, there is a limited amount of storage. And in some cases, bandwidth is not meant to be a free-for-all. And so if we let anyone do whatever they want with those resources, it's going to be a tragedy of the commons. And we won't be able to do to make the most of what we have. Another one that I feel very strongly about, I'm happy to be challenged on this, but I feel that any solution that requires to have the whole web coordinate and agree on what is the best model, the best version, the best quantization for a given use case and a given device is never going to work, or it's going to be very hard to pull off. And even if we were to do so, you end up with a situation that's the best situation, the best model for today. But then, as we know, AI is still evolving very fast. And so getting to do that again next year is going to be very tedious. And it's not going to be flexible enough if we need to get people to agree on things all the time. So given this challenge, I I thought I would like maybe share a few guiding principles that maybe can help us focus on potential solutions. The first one is that I don't think we should try to like solve the generic cross-origin sharing problem. As the image like we present, it's full of like traps and whatnot. It's really, really hard. And also some aspect of it, I'm a bit skeptical that there is a lot of value. Like sharing a resource that is maybe less than 1 megabyte, is that really important? Like it's not the end of the world if you have multiple copies of it. For most users, it's not going to be the thing that makes you leave the site or stay on it. So I think AI models are more interesting because they are order of magnitude bigger. And so there is more impact to unlock. And so that's why I would like to suggest is that we should find high values areas where the target resource or the scope makes it easier to solve and also more appealing to solve. And when it comes to AI, I think there is something interesting. Like when you store something on your device, like what you store is really not important if you don't really know what that thing can do, right? Knowing that you have a thing, but not knowing how to use it is not very useful, especially if you are trying to help people make the most of something that has like some finite amount of storage available. So if we knew what is being stored and what it can be used for, I think it can open up a range of solutions where we can mix and match things. We don't have to necessarily have the exact match for what you want, ideally, but maybe there's something that is good enough for your use case that we could use instead. So maybe let me explain that a bit more. AI models are not your regular like static resource. The way I see it is kind of like a skill in a box. It's something you can take and say, okay, I have this model, it can do sentiment analysis. It is good enough for that. If you want a different model to do sentiment analysis, you could still do that. You could still download one more model, or you could say, well, I'm not willing to have my user wait for like many seconds to do that. I'm just going to use what's available. That model is meant to be good enough. Let's just use what's readily available on the device. So I think it's interesting, unlike other resources where you can't really swap those things around. Like if you look at maybe a game engine, you're not going to swap Unity for Unreal, right? The developer will have to put a ton of work to make that possible. But I think AI could be easier to do because as long as you know what it can do and you know how to run it, you can make that a bit more transparent to developers. All right. So I have a bunch of hypotheses and some actions that we are taking, and I want to share a few things that I've learned so far, just to inform the discussion. In terms of like pockets of outside values, like things to test out, I have a couple. Like the first one is this idea that maybe for IT admins in an enterprise education context, there might be a need for deploying AI models across origin, especially across internal websites, or maybe for third-party solutions like Concur, SAP, Salesforce, the tools that people use within those organizations. Potentially a simple solution for that could be a group policy where you would say, I want to deploy model XYZ and make those available on origin A, B, and C. So maybe that's a solution. Another one could be for companies that have multiple websites. Like maybe they want to share their AI models across their properties. And one, like what I would say is an obvious solution for that would be to use the related website sets, commonly known as third-party sets, where maybe you can use that to carve up some like exemptions to the partition storage. So that's another one. And then a final one could be for third-party integration, like things that people use across websites, widget, like snippets. Maybe there's also a need to share AI models. And I think for that, it's more kind of like what I talked about, which is a set of APIs where you can ask what sort of models are already available locally and choose to use that instead of using your preferred model. All right. In terms of what we are doing, all of that is like a lot of like assumptions. And so what I'm trying to get to understand is like, is there a demand for any of those? And are like those potential solutions really going to work out? And so I'm doing a UXR survey, and I want to do follow-up with developers to really understand their world and their constraint. Another thing that I've been starting to do is looking at some data that's already available. So if you look at Transformer.js model, you can see that it's very top-heavy. The vast majority of the downloads are dominated by a couple of use cases, as you can see on the left side. And then if you look at the top models for each use case, you can see for most of them, it's only a couple of models that you need to pay attention to get the vast majority of the downloads. The bar on the side is like the size of the model. So as you can see on the feature abstraction, not the size, the number of downloads. The first model is like accounting for the vast majority of the download. And then after that, it's the second model, like a giant chunk of it, and a very long tail of like smaller models. Then what about the size of this model? So again, here for each of the top use case, I looked into the number one unquantized size of the model. And also on the second row, you can see the unquantized size weighted by download. So in a sense, it's like the typical size you would see if you were to observe a user like doing feature abstraction. One thing to note is that with quantization, you can bring that down by a couple of factors. So like overall, I think it's manageable. It's not like crazy high. All right, and then finally, some very early result from the UXR survey that I mentioned. It's still ongoing, so please take that with a grain of salt. But in terms of like the IT and mean scope, it seems like there is some interest. And the way people think about it is that it's mostly a mix of off-the-shelf model, but also custom fine-tuned models for the orgs. It's also a mix of like internal website, but also like third-party solution. And it's also typically for improving the performance or adding new AI power feature or to customize the models to the organization use. So that's one. Multi-website companies, this one is a bit different. You can see that it's there's a bit there's some weird things going on there. I should fix that slide later. But anyway, I can share the slide later. And then for the third-party integration, it's also similar in terms of like a mix of both off-the-shelf model and proprietary models. And about this idea of like having APIs where you can discover what's available and use it if it matches your needs. I was asking if people really want control over the model and the version and whatnot, or if they just care about the functionality. And it's kind of like a mixed bag. It's like 60%, 40%. So maybe there's still something to explore. And with that, that's all I have to share. So I want to make sure that we spend time discussing this space. Any concern, like challenge that we should pay attention to, or anything that seems like maybe it could fly?
There are lots of open-ended topics in this. The first thought that comes to mind is, I think this focused a lot on storage, but for it to work across browsers, we may need to settle on a common model format or ops so that the same model could work. Or if you're saying these are more like we are generalizing these capabilities, then we need to standardize on the kinds of inputs and outputs for each of those capabilities so that what's happening underneath it would be abstracted away.
I guess to extend that, are you mostly focused on the download and storage deduping, or also concurrent runtime execution across sites deduping the compute, like memory?
That's a good question. I think it goes back to the various like magic aspect. I don't know if I wrote this one. Yeah, actually I removed it. But one of the magic aspects of built-in AI is that there is an AI runtime, and we can make sure the models we choose can run with it. When you open that up to more models, there are like different AI runtimes. So do we want to find a solution where everyone agrees on the AI runtime and it is just one? Or do we need to expand that to cover additional AI runtime that we need also to share across origins so that we can run all the models, whichever like format they come in? So that, I don't know. Like both options could be something to explore.
I think runtimes are expensive, to develop, expensive to ship, expensive to have too many off. So I think we should somehow provide optionality. Going back to what he said about formats, and deciding on some sort of format that we want to maybe say at least try out a couple of options for formats and see if different runtimes are able to parse them. And we're probably maybe doing 1 or 2 at this time on the web. And I expect that only to scale. Like they do have format translators out available where you can do PyTorch to Onyx, Onyx to PyTorch, Onyx to StableHLO, back and forth from different ones. From what I understand, they're all in various levels of maintainability. So there's even if we did pick a format, that in itself has a lot of work.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. And you can feel the pain. When I was doing the Hugging Face, stats, it's very clear that format is the pain point because the models was available many flavors. And if you don't know what to look for, it's very hard for someone who comes in and say, well, I would like to do AI, but there are so many models, including quantization as well. It feels overly complex for what should be multi-impler. You want to do something, you pick the right model for it, and you shouldn't have to care about which AI runtime and whatnot.
There's a little bit of additional context in the Web Machine Learning Working Group. There was a proposal for a model loader API in addition to the WebNN API that had been discussed. Easiest way to think about the direction we were thinking the model loader API could go in the future is basically it's a serialization that guides the creation of a WebNN graph. And we figured, we could probably do that in user space for now until it's standardized. But even that doesn't solve the later problem of, okay, we're expecting that actual runtimes, even when you, in a given browser, build a WebNN graph, different ops, different data types might not be supported consistently across all machines. So that problem exists even separately from, yay, we've suddenly decided on a model format and a serialization.
So if we scope just to storage, the storage access API solve this, or where does it not solve it?
Yeah, so maybe I should know a bit more about that API, but is it an API where you provide the hash and if it
No, I think there was a talk yesterday from the Privacy Sandbox folks, but you request, hey, I want to unpartition at this moment, and you get a sort of scary looking prompt that says, hey, you might get tracked because this origin you're embedding is not going to be able to see what it could see when it was embedded on other origins or when the user was on that site itself. And it's interesting to think about, hey, you could have a more tailored UX, but you have to kind of think about the privacy properties of if you just essentially allowed cross-site tracking, you probably can't get a much more narrow UX anyway, and maybe just bring down all the force fields and unblock storage, right?
I would be worried if this permission is really scary and people say yes or no to it and not fully understanding what's going on, or they do understand what's going on and they say no, and none of that can happen, right? Because most people would say no. Whereas if we had something that's a bit more targeted and it's not really a huge fingerprinting vector, there is a higher chance that it all works out.
If you're curious about the storage API, there's also a session in the same room after the lightning talks where I'll be trying to cover some of the work by Tom Steiner and Christian, who did kind of look at the cross-origin possibilities for the storage API.
Okay, because if that one's kind of have a less scary problem, then it gets more interesting of okay, how are we going to constrain this? Make that safe? Is there a model reputation thing of oh, that model is definitely not the tell me if it's Eric model, right? So seems like an interesting space to explore, but tough.
It'd be interesting to explore. An interesting thing about models is that they're kind of more read only than other types of storage. So it would be interesting to see if we can come up with a version of storage access that only gives access to saved models and not other things. And then
you had a slide on non-quantized size of the model. Is that English only right now? Or?
It is whatever is most popular in terms of number of downloads as of March. It's like, I think it's monthly data.
Okay. And I know the storage is gonna be a key to share between. Is it even one of the goal, following up on this question, is it one of the goal to have multiple browsers share this model
You mean on the same device?
on the same device?
Maybe. I think it might be something else than this project, like
Most
necessarily
users,
like a web platform, kind of like what can we do for developers? If there are opportunities to do more than that, we should explore, but yeah.
Like one thing that'll happen is web GPU will get a lot more capabilities, and so the performance of native versus web GPU will be similar. So you don't need to really rely on the runtimes, and you could just let JavaScript run the models, and you just need to solve storage and sharing storage across sites.
Okay.
The only challenge there is NPUs, which are not programmable. And so then we have to think about whether we want model formats that are shareable, or do we want to have more task APIs, and if having task APIs is scalable or not.
come to the WASM web GPU and WebNN talk later in the day in this room.
That does sort of raise an interesting question about, there's a DP's point about like the size of models so it said frameworks. The design of most frameworks I'm aware of, except for maybe WebLLM, does the sort of conversion from the model to the underlying like GPU shaders or RevNN model on device. And so there's a potential sort of future improvement to the design of frameworks, which would allow much significantly lighter weight frameworks by pre-compiling the model into either like the bag of the GPU shaders or the WebNN model description, so that you're not carrying around sort of a large framework that you might not actually end up using all the pieces of, because you're not using one or more of the potential ways that framework can generate the underlying model that gets passed to the browser.
The question was similar to others. Is you have your slide about large models and models this and models that. Why not open it to the storing any file? You can go and do things. It could be a model.
The sharks.
It could be a video or an image or a level in an editor, and then the browser doesn't really need to care about what
I think
runtime.
there are ways where this could be done. Like if you look at this like group policy, it doesn't have to be limited to AI models, right?
Yeah,
if you want
exactly.
to store a big WASM thing across different origin, the reason I think this can work is that the IT admin ultimately is in charge and should be able to make the right trade-off about whether they want to have this like shared origin, shared resource, right? They can reason about the privacy and the benefits. And it's not like an API that a random website can trick user into abusing and whatnot, right? So maybe there are like options where this could work, and maybe the same for the multi-website companies. Like if this idea of like related website sense API is a way to recognize the fact that those belong to the same company and they can already like exchange data, why not making the storage non-partition for that?
I think IT admins and enterprise, those like mom and apple pie. Of course, they're like, it's the same person. They trust each other, but it's more the privacy aspect, the wilderness of the World Wide Web where people store.
For the generic case, like where it's like random sites and whatnot, and any resource, like it's a lot more concerning privacy-wise for one, but also in order to get actual value out of that, you need to have a user that visits site that use that same resource and within the time frame where that resource is still valid to boot. And the smaller resource tend to have very short live, max age and whatnot. So, and it's very hard to get people to change their ways. Like you will have to boil the ocean to do that. I think for AI models, because it's still very fresh, you could set some rules. You could say, if you really want to share your models, those are the rules that you need to follow. It has to have a good max age and or a style-wide revalidate window, so that we don't end up in this game where, yes, the resource is there, but I can't use it because it's not fresh anymore. I need to double check with the server. Like, it's not a good user experience.
Given that so many users, or maybe like this isn't going to be across the board, but so many users are multi-device users.
Mhm.
Has there been any thought to reduce the storage bandwidth and execution costs by allowing one device to share with another device? Like if I'm on my phone and it's lower powered,
Mhm.
maybe, but I'm next to my desktop, maybe it can offload execution of the model to there and return the request back. Still keeping it local.
Yeah, that could be interesting. It really depends on how often that situation arises. Maybe enterprise could be like a good context for that. I think there was a W3C working group that was exploring this kind of like idea of combining two devices, because beyond the storage, you could also imagine that maybe your smartphone is not powerful enough to run the LLM, but your laptop is plenty enough for that, and you could leverage that device. But it's like a set of conditions you need to clear in order to have that impact. So there's a lot like if, and it's not clear to me how often that happens. So
There's a lot of work that's been done across a number of particular web API features to do that kind of cross-device thing. And I think it's cool when you can do it, but the number of conditions, the number of hurdles you have to surmount to get to a state where that's can be done reliably is so high that I'm not sure it's the most important thing. But
Being much more useful and more achievable for the sort of agentic use of AI with browsing, where you've got one of your personal devices has all of your personal context, and you want to take advantage of that across all of your devices. But that's a very different use case than this, where it's developer provided models or developer selection of models, and you don't want it to have user context.
I think one approach we could have and discuss is maybe model registries. So we could either have model registries and have names and from which the browsers figure out, or you could converge on model formats, or you can converge on just input and outputs to the model. I think those are the three ways in which of these is the industry more inclined towards aligning on, like or the GPU approach, where all we allow is sharing storage and everything is just JavaScript.
Yeah, I do feel the more we know about what do you want and what for, the more flexibility we have about providing options that you may choose to use or not. So if you really want a Llama model for some reason, but you don't really care about the specific version, that's good to know, right? Knowing that you want a Llama model. If we have one, then we can provide that. It doesn't have to be Llama version, something quantization XYZ. So yeah, I think +1 to that, the more we know, the more we can make out of the device has. We have time. Any other last minute questions?
So are you looking for solutions so that requires zero user prompt? Is that the hard requirement?
Ideally, yes.
Okay.
Like as a product manager, I don't want to annoy a user if possible. Because the moment you do that, you expose yourself to like a lot of users saying no for like the wrong reason. Giving user choice is definitely important, but I think a permission prompt is really, really hard to get right.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense because I think the storage access API and other APIs are somehow so relying on the user prompt at some point. So I think in order to find the solution, I think we need to think about something fundamentally different. So so I understand.
I jump in and say that developers are working around this problem now by asking users to install an extension, which then provides that LLM service or whatever across multiple sites. So that's the bar we have to do better than.
One question could be on built-in AI, hardware. It so depends on the hardware on how these models are going to run and how the performance is going to be when you start distributing. Have you valid two questions there? Is there some sort of a quality bar or a quality metrics that you're looking for bare minimum built-in AI to be enabled on those machines?
Yeah.
And second, have you validated with developers? I'm sure you have on do they really want this? And if you know, is this a long tail developers are we looking at or are we looking at?
By quality, you mean performance?
Right. can it even handle this?
It depends on the use case, but we do have like a micro benchmark to understand is Gemini not going to work reasonably well or not. And that's maybe another part of the magic of built-in AI is we can do that, but like if you want to do it yourself, it's a lot more work. And so me, that's another like thing we should explore is can we do better here? Because I did hear developers asking for help on that. In terms of like the performance of it, it really depends on the use case. Like if you want to do something behind the scene, you don't really need like real time like token output. But if your whole use case is like a chat interaction, it has to be like fast enough.
So for a case like summarization, right? How can a developer trust that this API is going to return a correct summary? And maybe that's not a solvable problem. In the spec should say that have user interface to say that this is AI generated. Otherwise, the developers will be left trying to detect what browser and model is being used and block it on some browsers because they don't know if it's going to be a correct summary or not.
Yeah, I do think more guidance for developers is where we should go. So making it clear that it's generated by AI for one, and then providing feedback loops so that they can understand how well or how bad this is going. And then hopefully like reach out to the individual browser to help us get better.
Yeah, if even today with our current SLMs, if you give a complex enough paragraphs, it gets confused and makes associations that are not true. So
yeah,
like the new summarization on iOS devices, right? That's SLM and it gets things wrong.
Yeah, and that's also why we want to use fine tuning to improve on that. We have ways to measure for accurate or like hallucination and things like that. And we want to improve on that. So hopefully we do reach the bar. And if you want more, I think at some point you need to understand that there is some limits to what we can do with on device, and maybe you should switch to a server-side approach.
Is there some plan for mobile Android with this, or it's primarily only through extensions now?
Like we want to bring that across as many devices as possible, and that does include mobile. It's just question of priority, and like on laptops we have a bit more like hardware to work with. So just prioritization.
Okay, thanks.
With the previous topic, rather than user interface, I think what I would prefer is having the spec have test cases. Like, here are like 1,000 summarizations where the results should be accurate, measured some way for you to say that the API is compatible. So it gives some level of guarantee for developers to feel like, okay, the summarization that I get out of this API is something I can follow. But of course, we're never going to be perfect. There will be some edge case paragraph,
which is also why I want to make that more open so that the ecosystem can provide additional data about the different models and which model is good at what. All right. Thank you.